welcome to the Global Narratives podcast. Today we are diving into something pretty close to home. We're talking about Hezbollah and their presence right here in Canada.
Yeah, Hezbollah. You often think about them, overseas, but their footprint here in Canada, well, let me tell you, it goes back decades. We're talking fundraising, we're talking procurement, and even some potential links to organized crime.
So it's a complicated story for sure with a lot of implications, and that's exactly what we're going to try and unravel today, starting with who Hezbollah is and how they've been operating here in Canada historically. Then we're going to look at some more recent activity that's been raising some eyebrows, and we're going to really try and get to the bottom of the potential threat they could pose.
A good starting point, I think, is Hezbollah themselves. Canada designated them as a terrorist organization way back in 2002, but they've also got this significant political and social presence, particularly in Lebanon's Shiite community.
Right, and that complexity is really important to remember because, not every Lebanese Shiite supports Hezbollah, but the group's kind of deep roots in that community make it that much harder to track their activities.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, estimates suggest there are about 35,000 Shiite Lebanese folks in Canada. Not saying that they're all Hezbollah supporters, but it gives you an idea of the potential size of the community we're dealing with here.
And, the scale matters when we're talking about a group that's been linked to some pretty serious stuff like fundraising and procuring military equipment right here in Canada. And some reports from the early 2000s even detailed Hezbollah members actually buying things like night vision goggles and blasting devices in Canada.
And these weren't just random purchases, The intention was very clear to use this equipment in attacks against Israel. So it really kind of lays bare how Hezbollah was able to exploit our system.
It's a little chilling to think that those transactions were happening right here, right under our noses. And it wasn't just equipment either. There's evidence they were involved in bigger, more complex criminal schemes here.
Yeah. The RCMP, they actually linked Hezbollah to those auto theft rings in Ontario and Quebec back in the early 2000s. Those operations, they were bringing in millions of dollars and they were funneling that money right back to Hezbollah.
So they were essentially using Canada as a giant chop shop to finance their activities overseas.
Essentially, yeah. And as time went on, it seems like their activities evolved too. We see a shift, from smaller time stuff like car theft to something much more sophisticated and potentially dangerous. We're talking about narco-terrorism.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. In 2019, the DEA, they uncovered a massive money laundering operation in Toronto that had links to Hezbollah. And even more concerning, that operation was linked to Colombian drug cartels and potentially involved in fentanyl distribution.
Right, and that case is a perfect example of how Hezbollah's tactics have evolved. They're not just relying on traditional fundraising methods anymore. They're getting involved in these lucrative and destabilizing criminal enterprises.
And this begs the question, if they're willing to engage in that level of criminal activity, what else are they capable of doing?
It's a question worth exploring for sure. We're going to dive into the potential threats and vulnerabilities, too, including that visitor visa to asylum pathway that's been raising some serious concerns about exploitation.
Yeah, that pathway is really fascinating to me. It seems like individuals can enter Canada on a visitor visa and then claim asylum, and that lets them stay in the country while their case is being processed, even if it ultimately gets rejected.
Right, you've hit a key point. That process can take years. And in that time, it's possible that individuals with ties to Hezbollah could be integrating themselves into Canadian society, potentially flying under the radar of our security services.
That's a sobering thought. And to give you an idea of the numbers, data from the Immigration and Refugee Board suggests that over the past decade, we could be looking at potentially 4,000 to 4,500 Shiite Lebanese entering Canada through that pathway.
Now, obviously not everyone using this pathway is a threat, but it highlights a vulnerability in our system, especially given Hezbollah's history of operating in Canada.
Okay, so we've got this documented history of Hezbollah fundraising and procurement in Canada, potential involvement in organized crime, and this possible influx of people through the asylum system who might have ties to the group. It's a lot to unpack. I bet our listeners are wondering, what does this mean for Canada? What kind of threat are we really facing?
That is the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's a simple answer. It requires, a careful look at Hezbollah's capabilities, their intentions, and the complexities of monitoring a group like this within a free and open society. It is, and it's worth pointing out that historically, Hezbollah hasn't actually carried out attacks on Canadian soil. Typically, they've used Western countries like Canada more as bases for fundraising and logistical support rather than as actual targets for violence.
So you're saying they're more focused on exploiting our systems than actually attacking us directly. But does that exploitation, potentially make us more vulnerable in the long run?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because even though Canada itself might not be a direct target, we could still see consequences from their actions, like financial support for their operations elsewhere.
Right.
Okay.
Let's break that down a bit for our listeners. We talked about roughly 35,000 Shiite Lebanese in Canada. What if even just a tiny percentage of them, say 1%, are actively supporting Hezbollah financially?
Even at 1%, that's still 350 people. Let's say each person gives $100 a year. That's $35,000 going to a designated terrorist organization from Canada. Now bump that up to 5% or even 10% support. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially fueling activities that could threaten global security.
That's a pretty disturbing thought, and it really, it underscores those millions that were funneled through those auto theft rings we discussed earlier. It just shows how far the financial tendrils of these organizations can reach.
Exactly, yeah. And the financial side is really just one piece of the puzzle. We've also got to consider the potential impact on Canada's international relationships, particularly with allies like the U.S. and Israel, who see Hezbollah as a major threat.
Right, because if they start seeing Canada as a sort of permissive environment for Hezbollah's operations, that could definitely strain those relationships.
What about the potential for increased tension and polarization within Canada itself? We already saw some of that with those pro-Hamas rallies where Hezbollah flags were on display. Absolutely, and those rallies, they sparked counter-protests and really heated debate about freedom of expression versus, a tacit support for terrorist groups. It's a very complex and sensitive issue, and it highlights the need for, really nuanced discussion and a delicate balance.
Okay, so given all these complexities, how can Canada even begin to address the threat of Hezbollah?
Yeah.
What are some concrete steps that can be taken to prevent our systems from being exploited and really safeguard national security?
Well, I think it starts with, robust intelligence gathering and monitoring. Our security agencies need the resources and the authority to really effectively track Hezbollah's activities, both within the Lebanese Shiite community and more broadly within their global network.
I imagine that's a pretty daunting task,
Yeah.
It's not like they're having public meetings and announcing their intentions. So how do you even begin to penetrate a network that operates so much in the shadows?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and it requires this multifaceted approach. Targeted intelligence gathering is crucial, right? Instead of blanket surveillance, we need to focus on specific individuals and networks based on credible intelligence. And that requires cooperation between all sorts of agencies, both domestic and international.
So targeted intelligence is key. But what about those systemic vulnerabilities we were talking about, like the visitor visa to asylum pathway? Should Canada consider reforming that system, making it tougher for people with potential ties to terrorist organizations to exploit it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There are no easy answers there. It's all about striking a balance between protecting national security and also upholding our values of fairness and due process. One possible option might be to, strengthen the screening process for visitor visas and asylum claims, maybe through better information sharing between agencies.
But wouldn't that raise some concerns about potential discrimination, unfairly targeting specific communities?
Absolutely, and those are very valid concerns. Any reforms to the system, they would need to be super carefully considered and implemented in a way that respects individual rights and avoids, profiling whole groups based solely on where they come from or their religion.
It sounds like we're walking a tightrope here. We need to be vigilant, but without sacrificing our core values. But this can't just fall on the government's shoulders, can it? What role does the Lebanese Shiite community itself play in addressing this issue?
Oh, that's a critical piece. Absolutely. Engaging with the community, building trust and really fostering dialogue. That's all essential. It's about working with community leaders and organizations, addressing their concerns, encouraging people to come forward and report any suspicious activity they might see.
Right. But approaching a community with just accusations and suspicion, that could easily backfire, couldn't it? It feels like it requires a really sensitive and delicate approach.
You're absolutely right. It's not about pointing fingers or creating divisions. It's about building bridges, fostering understanding, and really working together to address these shared concerns. Open communication and mutual respect are paramount here.
So it sounds like there's no one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to take a multifaceted approach that involves intelligence, policy reform, community engagement, and a lot of open dialogue. What does this all mean for our listeners then? What are some key takeaways they should be thinking about?
Yeah, it feels like we're dealing with this tangled web of really interconnected challenges. So where do we go from here? What are some of the big takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest one is just awareness, right? We've got to understand the potential threats from Hezbollah being here in Canada, not to live in fear or anything, but to be informed and engaged citizens.
Right. It's not about panicking. It's more about, recognizing how complicated this is and advocating for solutions that are well-informed and proactive. Exactly. Yeah. And as we've been talking about, those solutions need to come from different angles. There's no magic bullet, right? It takes a combination of good intelligence, law enforcement, immigration reform, and really meaningful engagement with communities.
And it seems like open and honest dialogue is so crucial, both within government and within our communities themselves.
Oh, absolutely. We need to be talking about this, not shouting about it, right? We got to listen to each other, understand different perspectives, and work together to find some common ground.
That's a great point. To find solutions that protect our security without, sacrificing our values of diversity and inclusion, that takes careful thought and real collaboration.
It's a balancing act, for sure. But it's one that I think, as a nation, we can achieve.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive, I got to say. We've covered a lot, and it's clear there's a lot more to explore and discuss on this topic. I hope our listeners are walking away with, a deeper understanding of the challenges we face and the need for, smart and proactive solutions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thanks for, leading us through this complex and really important topic.
And of course, a huge thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into Hezbollah's presence in Canada. Don't forget you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube, and TikTok. And be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy the show. Until next time.